Resident Evil has an entire history of viruses, parasites, and fungal organisms that do insanely horrific things to the organisms that come into contact with them. And today we're going to be going through every single distinct pathogen in the games and the CGI movies, comparing what the series claims it does to what real-world virology, genetics, parasitology, and mycology actually allow. But that's not all, because then we're going to be ranking each one from real to unreal. Each pathogen will receive a realism score out of 10 based on these factors: how plausible its basic mechanism is, how it spreads, what it does to the host, how quickly those changes happen, and whether the body could physically supply enough matter and energy for any of it to work. But I know what you're thinking. It's starting to sound a bit too technical. It was for me as well when I first started Resident Evil, so before we can judge Umbrella's science, we need to establish what real viruses can actually do. And this next section is important for really understanding why I ranked everything the way that I did. Okay, so what is a virus? Time to channel our inner Roanoke's. Despite how casually Resident Evil throws terms around like Progenitor, T-Virus, and G-Virus, a real virus is surprisingly simple. Imagine your body as an enormous city made from trillions of tiny building blocks called cells. Cells are the smallest living units inside of your flesh bags, and each one works like a miniature factory, using its own machinery to build proteins, repair damage, and perform whatever job that particular cell has been assigned to. For example, muscle cells help you move, nerve cells carry messages, and skin cells form a protective barrier around you. Now, in this analogy, a virus would be a tiny intruder carrying a set of instructions for taking over one of those factories. Said instructions are written in either DNA or RNA. DNA is like the cell's master instruction book, while RNA is more like a temporary note copied from one of its pages. Changing the note may only affect what the cell does for a little while changing the master book can affect that cell and any new cells that it makes for much longer. Both RNA and DNA can change, but changes made to DNA last longer usually because RNA is meant to be temporary. If somebody can translate that into Minecraft terms in the comments, I'll pin the best one and give you a cookie. Human cells use DNA to store the instructions needed to build and maintain the human body. However, a virus carries a smaller set of instructions, mostly concerned with making more copies of itself. Wrapped around those viral instructions is a protective shell made of protein. Proteins are tiny tools and building materials used throughout living things, and the virus's protein shell is called a capsid. Now that sounds complicated, but really a capsid is just the virus's protective case, keeping its DNA or RNA safe as it travels between cells. Brad, you still with me? You guys still here? Some of you guys who played football all of high school probably already know all of this, but not everybody does, so I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Now, due to the fact that a virus is this tiny package of genetic instructions that can't do anything on its own, it has to break into one of your cells and use that cell's machinery to make more copies of itself. Viruses also have specific targets. Proteins on the surface of a virus must match receptors on a cell that it's trying to get into, like a key fitting into a lock. Hang on, this is relevant, so stick with me. This preference is called tropism, which means a virus is better at infecting certain cells than others. What does that mean? It means that a virus suited to your lungs cannot automatically take over your bones, muscles, and brain. And that is where Resident Evil leaves reality behind. Real viruses can damage cells and disrupt how tissues work, but they can't inspect the entire body and coordinate it into a new creature. So in our example, a virus can hijack a factory. I can't English right now. A virus can hijack the factory, but it's not going to be able to redesign the entire city, so to speak. So if a virus is incapable of redesigning an entire body, what can it actually do? This brings me to the next question, which is, how do viruses make people sick? Once a virus gets inside of a cell, it can do things like stop it from doing a normal job, damage or kill it completely. And if enough cells inside of one organ are damaged, that organ begins struggling to function. But the virus is only part of the problem. Your immune system, basically your body's security force, recognizes the infection and begins to attack it, which causes inflammation. Inflammation just means the infected area becomes swollen, irritated, while your body is trying to fight back. However, there are certain times when the immune response becomes so aggressive that it harms healthy tissues as well, and this is where Resident Evil touches real biology. Viruses can damage the brain and cause confusion, aggression, hallucinations, or loss of coordination. Rabies is the obvious example, but real neurological infections usually make people weaker and less capable as the damage exacerbates. But Resident Evil removes that limitation. Throughout the series, we see that its infected can lose most of their higher brain function, suffer massive physical damage, and still remain strong enough to hunt people for days, whereas in real life, viruses are capable of damaging the body and altering behavior, but the more damage that they cause, the less functional the person normally becomes. And this is precisely why zombies, just in general, are practically impossible in real life. Naturally, one would start asking, okay, so how do viruses spread? A virus can only cause an outbreak if it can move from one host to another, and the way that it does this is through something called transmission. Some viruses spread through air, some through bodily fluids, contaminated food or water, or insects like mosquitoes and ticks. Rabies usually spreads through bites because the virus is present in an infected animal's saliva. However, a virus cannot automatically use every method at once. Its structure and the cells it's targeting usually make it better suited to certain routes. A respiratory virus, for an example, has to survive in the air and infect the nose, throat, or lungs, while a blood-borne virus has to survive inside of blood and reach cells deeper in the body. In the games, we see that the T-Virus, for an example, is able to spread through a multitude of different ways. And sure, in real life, a real virus can spread in more ways than one, but for it to become equally effective through every possible route would actually require more than one convenient mutation. In reality, the T-Virus shouldn't be able to transmit through so many different ways and still be effective in infecting the host in all those different ways equally. You guys still with me? I hope that made sense. Everybody got it? This brings us to the most abused word in Resident Evil, mutation. But what does mutation actually mean? Even though the series uses this term all the time, a real mutation is dramatically less dramatic. A mutation is simply a change in genetic instructions. Viruses make enormous numbers of copies of themselves, yet those copies are not always perfect. One small mistake in the self-replication process might do something like help the virus spread more easily or avoid part of the immune response. But what mutations do not do is give a virus the ability to look at someone's body and decide they need claws, tentacles, or another freaking eyeball. You know what I mean? Like, a copying mistake isn't going to make a new freaking creature. Now, some of you guys who walked around with your guitars in high school are probably thinking, actually, BHG, the scientists in Resident Evil use something called genome editing. Relax, Fad. Go play Wonderwall by the tree and wait, I'll get to that. Resident Evil's quote-unquote mutations are closer to metamorphosis, meaning one body rapidly changing into another form, except in real life, metamorphosis only works because animals like caterpillars are born with the instructions and the structures needed to do it. A human body simply does not contain a hidden tyrant or licker blueprint waiting for a virus to switch it on. Even if you were to change somebody's DNA, it's not going to instantly rebuild them. On top of that, the body would still need time, energy, and physical material to grow every single new bone, muscle, organ, and blood vessel. Which brings us to the next issue in Resident Evil. Whenever somebody suddenly doubles in size or grows a new limb, where is all that extra body coming from? Ant-Man, we're looking at you. Literally impossible. But also, remember when I covered the story of Resident Evil Outbreak Files and there was that scientist who died and then a little chode ripped out of her body and then jumped up the elevator and morphed into this giant BOW and the survivors had to kill it with a train? This is what I'm talking about. In fact, whenever somebody suddenly grows another arm or does whatever Carla does in RE6 and transforms into a giant wall of flesh, the game is straight up just ignoring the question of where does all the extra body come from? Because matter isn't going to appear out of nowhere. This is part of thermodynamics, which is the set of rules governing matter and energy. If William Birkin gains 100 pounds of bone, muscles, and organs, his body would need 100 pounds of raw materials to build them. Now, the body can use stored fat and existing tissue, but turning those materials into new muscles, nerves, and bones takes time. It also requires enormous amounts of energy, which cells store and spend using a molecule called ATP. ATP is essentially the body's energy currency. Every time a cell builds or repairs something or just moves, it has to pay for it, and that's what ATP is. And this is why real healing is slow. We can't use a spray or green herbs to heal from explosions or brutal onslaughts. Even repairing a cut requires nutrients and time. Regrowing half of your body in the middle of a boss fight would require more material and energy than a human body could possibly provide, and that heat produced by that much activity would probably kill you before the transformation even finished. But somehow, in Resident Evil, the host is alive through the entire process. Almost there, guys. Lock in. You almost have everything you need to understand how these rankings work. Scientists can deliberately change DNA through something called genome editing, which means cutting, removing, or replacing specific parts of an organism's genetic instructions. Viruses can also be modified and used as delivery vehicles to carry new instructions into certain cells. Every trait in the human body is controlled by a number of genes working together, and changing one instruction can accidentally affect several other parts of the human body. Alright, so genome editing is real, and scientists may become better at changing DNA in specific parts of the body, but what we can't do right now is safely rewrite every important cell in a person at once. It is technologically impossible, and even if we could, instantly transforming that body is biologically impossible as depicted in Resident Evil. It breaks the rules of biology and physics. One final distinction before we start ranking. Not every infection in Resident Evil actually comes from a virus. A parasite is a living organism that survives by living inside or on another organism. Unlike a virus, it's got its own physical body. Las Plagas and the Nemesis parasites, for example, attach themselves to a host and then interfere with the nervous system instead of rewriting cells, almost like somebody plugging a second controller into the body. The mold is closer to a fungus, meaning it can grow, feed, and spread through networks of living material. It doesn't need to hijack one cell at a time in the way that a virus does, which gives it a little bit more freedom to physically spread throughout a body. That doesn't make Las Plagas, Nemesis, or the mold realistic, but it does mean that we can't judge all of them by the same exact rules. So with that out of the way, we can finally start with the pathogen that gave Resident Evil nearly everything else, the Progenitor virus. Of course, I have the entire story of Resident Evil explained from 0 to 9 and everything around and in between if you want more depths to Resident Evil as a series, but I'll give short recaps so that everybody is on the same page. Progenitor was discovered in West Africa in a rare flower called Stairway to the Sun. We see this in Resident Evil 5. According to local legend, anybody who ate the flower and survived would gain incredible abilities on some Black Panther type things, although most people just died. Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford eventually began studying the virus found inside of the flower, and their research would become the foundation for the Umbrella Corporation, as well as many of the viruses that followed after. Umbrella was officially founded in 1968 while secretly using the company as a front to continue developing biological weapons based on Progenitor. So what does the Progenitor supposedly do? In the simplest of terms, the Progenitor changes an infected person's DNA, and it pushes their body to become something stronger. Spencer was banking on the rare people who would survive and gain increased strength and intelligence, but there was a catch, something the series calls compatibility. Again, most people can't survive the infection, but there's a very small number of people who supposedly possess the right genetics to adapt and become something greater than human. They're compatible. This concept has a small amount of real science behind it. Your genes can affect whether a virus is able to enter certain cells, how your immune system responds, and how severe the resulting illness becomes. Two people exposed to the same virus can, therefore, experience very different outcomes. What is not realistic is reducing those outcomes to either death or superhuman evolution. The closest real-world comparison is a retrovirus. A retrovirus carries instructions as RNA, but after infecting a cell, it creates DNA copies of those instructions and inserts that DNA into the cell's own instruction book. That process is called integration, which basically means the virus has added one of its pages to the cell's book. That sounds dangerously close to what the progenitor does, but I wouldn't panic yet. There is an enormous difference. A real retrovirus will not intelligently rewrite the person's existing DNA into an improved version, and it's not going to automatically update every single muscle, bone, nerve, and organ cell throughout the body. So, the realism score for this one is a 2.5 out of 10. The retrovirus comparison gives progenitor a small foundation in real biology, and genetic compatibility is not complete nonsense, but controlled whole body transformation and superhuman enhancements are pure fiction. Of course, Spencer was not satisfied with a virus that killed almost everybody. He wanted a version that could produce superior humans that he believed deserved to inherit the world, which is what brings us to the virus he used on Albert Wesker. So eventually Spencer gets to the point where he realizes that he can't just simply release the progenitor into the population and expect to produce the kind of humans that he wanted, because even if someone survived, the virus could not control their personality, beliefs, or intelligence. So his solution was Project W, also called the Wesker Plan. At its core, Project W was eugenics, which is the belief that some people are biologically superior and that humanity can be improved by selecting or engineering more people like them. Spencer collected hundreds of children born to highly intelligent parents, gave every single one of them the surname Wesker, provided them with elite education, and secretly shaped them to share his worldview. Once they were adults, the most promising candidates were exposed to an experimental virus, what we are going to call the prototype virus. The virus acted as a final screening test. Anybody whose body could not handle it died, while the survivors were supposed to become Spencer's new generation of humans. The screening was so deadly that most of the candidates died. The files say that only a few survived, with Albert and Alex Wesker being the two named survivors who remain important to the entire story. Throughout the series, we see that Albert Wesker gained extraordinary physical capabilities, while Alex Wesker, from Resident Evil Revelations 2, survived without receiving the same superhuman upgrade. Shortly before the mansion incident, William Birkin gives Albert his dose of the virus, and he would inject himself with it, but later get impaled by the tyrant, and then he came back to life with superhuman strength, speed, and reflexes. He became the closest thing Spencer ever produced to his ideal human. But Albert's transformation runs into the same problem as the progenitor. His superhuman strength, speed, reflexes, and healing would require perfectly coordinated changes across his entire body. If even one thing was off, his entire body probably tears itself apart. So, the realism score for this prototype virus is 2 out of 10. The whole screening and genetics thing can influence who survives an infection, but surviving one would not turn somebody into a bullet-dodging superhuman, with only 7 minutes to spare. But to understand where this experimental virus comes from, we need to go back to Umbrella's first major attempt to turn Progenitor into a practical biological weapon, the T-Virus. The first thing to clear up, though, is that Umbrella didn't set out to make an army of zombies. The T stands for Tyrant, because their goal was to produce a powerful BOW that could survive extreme danger while remaining intelligent enough to follow basic orders. The Walking Dead were essentially the failed result produced when ordinary people were infected instead. James Marcus created the earliest T-Virus by continuing his work with Progenitor, and Umbrella would later develop several versions of it. We don't need to stop and rank every alpha, beta, and epsilon strain separately because they are mostly different stages of the same project. However, the basic goal remains intact. Take Progenitor's ability to alter living organisms and turn it into something that Umbrella could actually use as a weapon. So what happens when the T-Virus infects a normal person? It damages the body and brain until the infected host loses their memories, personality, and ability to think clearly, leaving behind little more than hunger and aggression. That gives us the classic Resident Evil zombie. The brain damage part is not complete nonsense. Viral infections can actually cause encephalitis, which means swelling and inflammation of the brain, and that could lead to confusion, hallucinations, and a bunch of other things. As kind of touched on before, the problem is that serious brain injury causes another list of things that would prevent the body from properly being controlled. Somehow, the T-Virus is able to remove parts of the brain that Umbrella doesn't need while preserving everything useful for chasing and eating people. You know what I mean? Like, zombies have lost so much of their brains, but they can still stand, walk, find people, and bite them. It's like smashing most of the controls inside of a car and somehow leaving behind only the exact buttons needed to drive directly towards Leon Kennedy. The T-Virus also infects an absurd range of organisms. Real viruses can cross between species, but they still depend on compatible cells and receptors, but the T-Virus works in humans, animals, and even plants. And then those mutations continue after infection. In the Spencer Mansion, for an example, if you damage a zombie but don't destroy its head, it can enter a dormant state and return as Crimson Heads, or the red zombies, with greater speed, strength, and muscle growth, while other T-Virus infections can progress into lickers with enlarged muscles, exposed brains, claws, and weaponized tongues. Now, in real life, viral dormancy is a real thing, but it doesn't give a virus time to secretly rebuild the host. Tyrants are slightly different because Umbrella selected particular subjects and developed them under controlled lab conditions. I'll be honest with you, building an organism gradually in a lab is a bit more believable than transforming somebody in the streets, but the finished creature still requires every part of the body to be upgraded together. Just because you made some large humanoid, thing doesn't automatically make the rest of its biology capable of supporting that size. Realism score for the T-Virus? 2 out of 10. The T-Virus borrows from real brain infections and cross-species transmissions, but functioning decomposed bodies, near universal host range, and complete anatomical reconstruction push it firmly into fiction. However, not every version of the T-Virus began as a weapon, though. One of its strangest strains was developed for something far more legitimate: treating cancer. In Resident Evil Outbreak File number 2, there was this strain of T-Virus, and instead of using it as a weapon, it was used as a treatment for cancer. It was T-JCCC203, and in the game's clinical records, a patient named Doug Frost receives this, and his cancerous cells are destroyed by the following day. Now, initially he appears healthy, but soon he develops this intense hunger. He begins to rapidly deteriorate, and he dies. Another patient, Dorothy Lester, suffered from an unspecified heart condition, but only one day after being infected with the virus, her heart problems went away. However, she too would start to have this voracious appetite. Surprisingly, the cancer treatment part is real. Scientists already use oncolytic viruses, which are viruses chosen or modified to infect and destroy cancer cells while causing less damage to healthy ones. So this is not something that is theoretical. You can look this up. It's T-Vec, the first FDA-approved genetically modified virus used to fight cancer. So this is one of the rare instances where Umbrella is actually using a medical idea that is real. But the unrealistic part is that after destroying the cancer, the virus suddenly begins producing normal T-Virus symptoms and then turns the patients into a zombie. Also, killing cancer cells wouldn't naturally cause brain damage, extreme hunger, and whole body degeneration. Umbrella would have to deliberately leave all of those harmful abilities inside of the treatment, which would make it possibly the worst designed cancer medicine in human history, and also pretty much counterintuitive. It's also important to separate this from genome editing. T-JCCC203, I'm just going to say T203, is not fixing the patient's DNA. It's more along the lines of sending a microscopic attack dog to target and destroy cancerous cells, and then rewriting the body's instruction book. So, I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10 on the realism score. The basis for this is already being used in medicine today, so it earns the highest score so far while losing half of its points for being an Umbrella product. And we're not making zombies with this. The next virus is in the exact opposite direction. Instead of selectively destroying cells, this one is going to allow the infected body to keep changing without ever reaching a final form. The G virus. Birkin developed it after studying Lisa Trevor, whose body had survived and adapted to years of viral experiments. Unlike the T virus, G causes continuous mutation and can reproduce through new G organisms that inherit its altered genetic information. When Umbrella's soldiers shoot Birkin and try to steal his research, he injects himself with the G. The virus saves his life, but his body continues to mutate throughout Resident Evil 2, growing new limbs, eyes, and enormous amounts of tissue until almost nothing human remains. Our bodies can repair damage, and some animals can even regrow limbs. This is called regeneration, which simply means replacing damaged or missing tissue. Despite our regenerative capabilities, we are much more limited. More importantly, regeneration follows an existing body plan. Skin repairs itself with skin. Bone repairs itself with bone. An injury is not going to tell the body to grow a giant eyeball or an extra arm because it might be useful for the next boss fight. The other thing is how the G virus reproduces. It does it by implanting G embryos into other people. For example, Birkin targets his own daughter, Sherry, because of her genetic compatibility with him. In real life, we have insects and parasites that lay eggs inside of living hosts, where the young develop by feeding on the host's body, so that is real. But G embryos grow far too quickly. A large creature would still need time to divide from a tiny embryo into billions of cells, and then to build the rest of its body, the working nervous system and everything. It can't just skip straight from implantation to chest-bursting monster within hours. We also see the same virus appear again in the CGI movie Resident Evil Degeneration, where Curtis Miller injects himself and undergoes another rapid G transformation and then starts to slaughter the Marines. His body changes differently from Birkin's, but the biological problem remains the same. Uncontrolled mutation somehow producing a functional monster instead of killing the host. So for that, we give the realism score a 1 out of 10 here. Now, moving on, somehow somebody later on looked at the T virus and the G virus and was like, hey, we should combine these two together. So we get the T+G virus. Umbrella's Paris lab wanted a virus that could produce a tyrant-like body while adding the G virus's extreme mutation, but the real gimmick was electricity. The in-game research file says that the T and the G virus refused to give a new strain of electrical properties, and version 0.9.2 was able to produce a high-voltage current and an electromagnetic barrier as well. Morpheus Duval, the main villain of Resident Evil Dead Aim, injects himself with that strain after being wounded and transforms into a tyrant-like creature while keeping his intelligence. I think this kind of shows that the T+G virus was more refined than the other two separately, because Morpheus didn't turn into a zombie or a mindless monster, basically. Now, this is still just two impossible ideas stacked together, so when we're looking at how realistic this can be, we have to remember same issues as before. T-Virus, same transformation problems. Morpheus changes too quickly, gains too much strength, and he somehow has his brain still working throughout the process. G-Virus side adds rapid mutation after damage, so I would say that the only new idea here is the electricity. Real animals can generate electricity. You got Pikachu. Electric eels use special cells that act like tiny biological batteries, but Morpheus would still need new electrical organs, nerves to control them, insulation to avoid frying himself, and enough energy to power the entire system. A virus isn't going to magically inject electric eel biology into an adult Homo sapien and have it work immediately, perfectly. The electromagnetic barrier thing is also harder to buy. A living body producing enough electrical force to block bullets would need an absurd amount of power. Realism score for this one is a 1 out of 10. Fear Magneto. Now we're going to be moving on to one of the more interesting viruses in the series, and there is the remake coming 2027. Let's see if they keep this the same or if they change some things around. The T-Veronica virus. This was Alexia Ashford's answer to one of Umbrella's biggest problems. You see, most of these viruses destroyed the host's minds. T-Virus could create zombies, lickers, and tyrants, but control was always the issue. Alexia wanted a virus that could transform the body, but still preserve its intelligence. And she would build this idea around Queen Ants. She says that she discovered the remnants of an ancient virus inside Queen Ant genes, and then implanted the Queen Ant gene into the mother virus that Spencer discovered, which is another name for the progenitor, and that experiment would then become the T-Veronica virus. Alexia was obsessed with the structure of an ant's colony, one queen ant at the center with workers and soldiers existing to serve her. She wanted a biological system where she remained the mind and everybody else became extensions of her will. Her first human test was her father, Alexander Ashford, and it failed horribly. In the game, we find him trapped in a chair with an axe against his chest, keeping him in place. And then later, Claire kills him while Steve is hanging out somewhere. But seeing the quote-unquote success that Lisa Trevor had, Alexia's solution was to inject herself, enter cryogenic sleep, and let the virus adapt to her body slowly over 15 years instead of all at once. This is the one clever idea that T-Veronica has. Now, I'm not sure if Capcom was doing this on purpose, but at least they're admitting that rapid mutation is a problem. At the very least, whether or not on purpose, at least they're covering all bases in case somebody like me starts to wonder, hey, how realistic are these things are? Just for, fun thought experiments. I know it's just a game. Of course it's not real. But we still have a problem here. It's that cryogenic sleep isn't going to magically solve the biology. Because if her body is truly frozen, her cells should not be actively changing. If her cells are active enough to slowly adapt to the virus, then her body still needs oxygen, nutrients, waste removal, and a working metabolism for those 15 years. But there is another issue, the queen ant logic. There is no simple queen gene you can paste into a human virus to create a hive mind. That behavior comes from an entire biology of ants, their bodies, brains, hormones, pheromones, and millions of years of evolution. Putting queen ant material into a human infection would not suddenly make people biologically wired to serve Alexia. Still, compared to the T-Virus, T-Veronica is at least trying to solve the right problems. Alexia keeps her mind. She can speak, plan, use her mutations instead of being consumed by them, and Steve is actually another example of this. He briefly regains control after mutation to protect Claire, which fits into the virus's theme, preserving more of the person than the T-Virus, but it wasn't enough to make it stable. Again, I can't wait for the remake because I want to see how they approach the T-Veronica virus to see if they change it or keep things the same. But for now, Realism score 2.5 out of 10. I do give T-Veronica slightly more credit than the T-Virus because of the fact that it recognizes the issues with time and brain preservation matter, but everything else, from the cryogenic adaptation to the queen ant control, still far beyond real biology. But we're going to move away from viruses for a moment because one of Resident Evil's most famous monsters was not controlled by a virus alone. The Nemesis parasites. When I first got into Resident Evil and started reading about the Nemesis parasites in Wesker's reports and then later seeing Nemesis in Resident Evil 3, I had initially thought that he was just a tyrant with a coat who could use weapons a little bit smarter than the average tyrant and that he just hated stars. But it is a T-103 tyrant implanted with the NE-alpha parasite, the Nemesis alpha parasite developed by Umbrella Europe to solve the intelligence problem that Umbrella was originally running into with the BOWs. Umbrella achieved the Nemesis T-type by implanting a Nemesis alpha-type parasite into a mass-produced tyrant. Do you guys remember that closer to the beginning of this video I was talking about how the Nemesis was like plugging a second controller into the body? Well, instead of relying on the tyrant's damaged brain, the parasite could help direct the host, recognize targets, follow commands, and use weapons. This is concisely why Nemesis is able to hunt down and stalk Jill with advanced behavior. And you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, what about Resident Evil 2? Is Mr. X a Nemesis? Because he actively stalks Leon and Claire. But no, he is just a model T-103 tyrant. He is under basic orders to retrieve the G virus and eliminate any stalkers, depending on the version of the scenario that we're talking about. Mr. X retains enough brain function to follow those simple orders, and he doesn't need a parasite to give him that extra cognition. The step above the tyrant is the Nemesis. And if you just look at them side by side, you can see that Nemesis has a far greater target recognition, weapon use, and persistence in comparison to Mr. X. But as a basic idea, this is a lot more believable than most of Resident Evil viruses. Real parasites can manipulate host behavior. Some can make animals take bigger risks, move to certain places, or behave in certain ways that help that parasite to survive and propagate. They're not literally piloting the host like a video game character, but it's the concept of a parasite changing behavior that is real. The problem with this is scale. It's one thing for a parasite to make an insect climb a plant, but it's another thing to make a super mutant fire a rocket launcher. Also, in the RE3 remake, we see the Nemesis parasites infecting ordinary zombies, which makes the idea easier to picture because the parasite is physically attached to the host rather than magically commanding the entire body from the bloodstream. But even there, we just gotta note that the host is already damaged, decaying, and neurologically compromised, so the parasite would be trying to steer a vehicle that's already falling apart. But Capcom would bring this concept back in Resident Evil Requiem through Dr. Victor Gideon, who is infected with the Nemesis Gamma, a newer parasite based on Umbrella's old NE Alpha research. He's basically the Requiem-era Nemesis figure, retains his intelligence, becomes stronger, durable, and eventually mutates into a Nemesis-like boss before Welcome Down Leon takes him out. Another interesting thing to note is that in-game, the product catalog says that the Nemesis Gamma is focused on cost reduction and performance enhancement, producing a major boost to physical ability and recovery, regardless of the host's durability. They basically made the Nemesis parasites more marketable. What if you could mass-produce the Nemesis idea and improve the host without needing a perfect tyrant body? Although Victor is pretty freaking huge to begin with, so I don't know. But from a realistic perspective, the Nemesis parasites deserve more credit than most viruses because they actually have something based in what nature does in real life. A parasite physically interacting with the nervous system is easier to conceptualize and see in real life than a virus rebuilding a whole body cell by cell. It's just, the whole scale thing. We're not going to make super weapons with parasites here. So realism score, we're going to give this a 4 out of 10. Okay, this next one has to be the most insane and horrific virus in Resident Evil. Now, of course, this isn't something that is officially or even widely accepted as canon, but it was still part of Resident Evil in a sense. So we're going to be talking about the 4D Executor virus. Quick note, the virus is never given an official name in the movie, but fans usually call it the Cameron Executor or T-Cameron virus. In the movie, Dr. Cameron is an Umbrella researcher in Racoon City connected to a virus that lets her move through other organisms. She appears through different infected bodies while still retaining her own identity, which means that this is not just a mutation anymore. It's basically the thing. The virus allows Dr. Cameron to body hop consciousnesses into different hosts. This, of course, breaks the realism almost immediately because a person's identity isn't stored in their DNA. DNA is just there to help build the body, but it's not going to contain our memories, personalities, or lived life experiences. So even if Cameron's virus could move genetic material into another organism, it's not going to carry quote-unquote Cameron with it. It might spread infection tissues or instructions for mutations, but it's not going to transfer her mind into a cockroach, a crow, a dog, or another human as if she's just uploading herself into a new body. As horror, it rules. As biology, it's barely biology. Realism score, 0.5 out of 10. The only thing keeping it above 0 is that viruses can carry genetic material and ulcer infected cells. Now we have reached Las Plagas from Resident Evil 4. If you didn't know, now you know there is a difference between the Ganados that we see in Resident Evil 4 and the other zombies. Las Plagas are parasites, while the zombies are infected with viruses. And of course, we've talked about those differences already. The Ganados, the village people, are very different from zombies, and you can see that they speak, use weapons, set traps, and collectively come down on Leon in coordinated attacks. Las Plagas will attach to their bodies, to their CNS, to their central nervous system, and the people lose their reasoning, their independence, but they still retain their intelligence and communication. Later, Plaga variants push this even further. RE5 uses the next generation of Plaga to create Magini, who are more aggressive and combat capable, while the movie Resident Evil Damnation uses dominant Plaga hosts to control lickers in battle. Like they mind control the lickers. I thought that was pretty cool. We also see the body horror side. When some hosts take enough damage, the parasite bursts from the head or neck and they keep fighting. Iconic? Absolutely. Biologically believable? Not really. If the host loses the brain structures needed for everything that a body needs, a parasite isn't going to keep the body operating like a puppet unless it somehow replaces all of those things. I'm still going to give Las Plagas a lot more credit than other Resident Evil, or most Resident Evil pathogens, because the core idea starts closer to real biology. I think you guys are seeing the trend here. Parasites just naturally have more credibility. So the realism score for Las Plagas is 6 out of 10. The parasite itself is the main organism. Behavior manipulating parasites are real, but it does lose points for full cult control, dominant subordinate command, and post-head damage movement. It's more realistic because the parasite is doing parasite things, just more exaggerated. And you might be thinking, okay, well, why does Nemesis, which is a parasite as well, get less points? And that's because it is less realistic, since the parasite is being used to control and upgrade a creature that already shouldn't exist. That's why that one got a lower score than Las Plagas. So from a Spanish village, we go to the bottom of the ocean. The T-Abyss Virus from Resident Evil Revelations. In the game, we learn that the Abyss virus is discovered in deep-sea fish, and then researchers combine it with T-virus material to create the T-Abyss virus. It becomes this aquatic bioweapon that can spread through water, infect sea life, and mutate humans into drowned, aquatic-looking creatures like oozes and sea creepers. Just real quick, if the fiction is taken at face value, honestly, the T-Abyss might be one of the most dangerous viruses in the entire series. The game's own research file says that if enough concentrated T-Abyss were released into the sea, it could contaminate all of the world's oceans in a very short time, starting with bacteria and spreading through the marine food chain. That is a global, ecological, world-ending disaster. If you haven't played or seen my video explaining the story of Resident Evil Revelations, I'm going to link that down below. The ocean virus part is not ridiculous, by the way. Viruses are everywhere in the ocean. The ocean is full of microscopic life, and viruses are a major part of that system. The problem is what the T-Abyss does with this idea. A real marine virus would still have limits. A virus that infects deep-sea fish would not automatically infect humans, reshape their bodies, and give them aquatic traits. Fish and humans have completely different cells. We've already talked about, one species not being able to rewrite another species. But I know what some of you guys are thinking. Viruses do cross species, and yeah, that part is real. A virus jumping from animals to humans is something called zoonotic transmission, and that does happen. Influenza, for an example, can move between birds, pigs, and humans. Coronavirus can jump from animals into humans. Rabies can infect many mammals. But those are still organisms with enough biological overlap for the virus to find compatible cells and replicate. A virus crossing from fish to humans would be difficult. A virus crossing from bacteria to fish to humans to giant sea monsters is, Resident Evil. Bacteria are not built like animal cells at all. A virus that infects bacteria is usually bacteriophage, and it is specialized for bacterial cells, not human cells. So the problem with T-Abyss is not cross-species infection. It's that the virus seems to infect wildly different life forms and produce, this is the part here you guys gotta recognize above all, they produce coordinated aquatic mutations in all of them. Like, you're not turning me into a merman, for an example. So for the T-Abyss, we're giving it a 3 out of 10 on the realism scale. Moving on, we're going to look at a virus that is less explained, and it's actually unnamed. But the reason that this virus stood out to me is because in Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, the virus can apparently be held back with inhibitors. So all we know about the unnamed virus is that it was used in the Panam Stam experiments, creating zombies, infecting soldiers, and that it can be held back with an inhibitor, which is basically a drug that suppresses infection instead of curing it. By the way, I have a story explained for this Netflix miniseries as well. In the story, we learn about Jason and the Mad Dogs, which is the group, the team that he was with. They were infected during the Panam Stam conflict. The soldiers get infected, but they don't turn into zombies, and this is because they have these inhibitors supplied by Tricell. They were kept dependent on these medications. Now, real medicine can sometimes suppress a virus without removing it from the body completely. HIV treatment is the easiest example to point out. Antiretroviral therapy can also reduce the amount of virus inside of a body and keep the infection controlled, but it is not considered a cure, so treatment is continuous. So from this, we know that a dangerous infection being suppressed by medication is not ridiculous. What is ridiculous, though, is the mutation that is waiting to break out. When Jason stops hiding what happened to him, he transforms into a giant BOW, and that brings us back around to the same Resident Evil problems. Because this virus is poorly explained, we're not going to be able to score it as confidently as something like Las Plagas or T-Virus, but the inhibitor concept does give it a stronger starting point than the others, so we're going to give this a 4 out of 10 on the realism scale. But now we're going to be talking about Albert Wesker's final answer to human evolution, the Uroboros Virus from Resident Evil 5. Uroboros was developed from the Progenitor research, but Wesker had a problem with this. The virus was too poisonous to be useful in humans, so instead of creating the next stage of evolution, it usually just killed the host. After Wesker discovered Jill Valentine, he discovered that her body had developed a powerful antibodies from her earlier T-virus infection, and he would use those antibodies to help make Uroboros less lethal. Wesker kept Jill alive specifically to produce antibodies for his research. In real terms, antibodies wouldn't, for a lack of a better term, teach a virus how to behave. It would apply pressure. Variants that could survive that pressure might become more useful for Wesker's experiments, but that's still very different from making a virus do what Wesker wanted the virus to do. If your body is compatible, Wesker believes you evolve into something superior, but if not, the virus would reject and consume you. Wesker's plan was to release the virus across the world and let it decide who would deserve to live. You're probably thinking, BHG, Wesker was operating on survival of the fittest. But real evolution doesn't work like that. It's not going to be a one-time purity test. Natural selection happens across populations and generations. Uroboros just kills or mutates people based on compatibility, but a virus isn't going to do that. A virus can't determine who's worthy or not. So scientifically, it is nonsense. But when Uroboros does reject a host, it creates black tendrils and consumes surrounding organic material. That does give it one small advantage over earlier viruses because it at least tries to explain where some of that extra mass is coming from. If it absorbs bodies, it has quote-unquote new raw material. But raw material still is not the same as instant tissue. Your body's not going to eat a steak and immediately turn it into a new arm. It's got to break the material down, move it throughout your body's systems, and then rebuild it into useful structures. Uroboros skips all of that and then converts whatever it touches into more Uroboros instantly, almost instantly. But actually, we see the rejection process with Excella. Wesker infects her with Uroboros, and instead of her becoming part of his superior human race, she mutates into a massive creature. Wesker himself is the important exception, and this point needs to stay clear. His vampire superpowers don't come from Uroboros. He already had those super speed and strength abilities from the prototype virus. Uroboros is what he injects later as a desperate move against Chris and Sheva after being weakened, but even then his final form is unstable. We're going to be giving this a realism score of 1.5 out of 10. Credit where credit is due, Uroboros does use antibodies during development and shows absorbing outside organic material, but everything else is just Resident Evil fantasy. Moving on, we're going to be talking about a virus that tried to combine multiple earlier ideas into one, the C virus from Resident Evil 6. The C from C virus comes from the word chrysalid, which is the cocoon-like shell that some infected hosts form before emerging as something completely mutated. It was basically mutation on demand. With the T-Virus, most ordinary victims become zombies. With G, the body mutates continuously, loses control. The C-Virus tries to be more versatile. It can create zombies, but in the same way Las Plagas creates ganados, the C-Virus creates Jaavo. These infected people retain enough intelligence and fight like soldiers. When they're damaged, the virus can mutate the injured area and give them new limbs. So for an example, you shoot off a monster's arm, the virus is going to give the host a better arm, quote unquote better. Lose a limb, grow a weapon. Take enough damage, you get wrapped inside of a chrysalid and break out into some new form. But again, this is where biology falls apart. We've talked about metamorphosis, but that only works because the animal is already born with that life cycle built into their biology, and a human doesn't have a hidden moth, dinosaur, or insect blade arm soldier thing waiting inside of them. However, in Resident Evil 6, Carla Radam creates the enhanced C virus by way of Jake Mueller's blood because his blood is resistant to the viral infection, and this is because he is Albert Wesker's biological son. That enhanced strain is what allows Derek Simmons, Piers Nevins, RIP to Piers, thank you Chris, and Carla herself to undergo their more extreme mutations. Of course, the biology still doesn't make any sense. Simmons mutates through several giant forms, a freaking dinosaur, you know what I mean? Piers develops an arm capable of electric attacks, and Carla's body loses normal structures, turning into this giant wall of white liquid flesh, maybe liquid candle wax, or something else that's white and liquidy. Realism score 1 out of 10. The C virus gets 1 point for having real biological concepts in injury response, regeneration, and metamorphosis, but everything else is just video game logic. But moving forward, we have the T-Phobos virus from Resident Evil Revelations 2. The T-Phobos virus is Albert Wesker's sister's experiment with fear. In RE Rev 2, Claire Redfield, Moira Burton, and other TerraSave captives are taken to Sem Island, and they're infected with the T-Phobos and forced through a series of tests while wearing bracelets that monitor their fear. The entire time, Alex is observing whether they survive the infection, as well as how they respond psychologically. The virus is named after Phobos, the Greek personification of fear, and that tells you the entire gimmick. T-Phobos reacts to fear. Fear is the trigger. Should the infected host remain mentally stable, the virus stays under control. But if their fear spikes too high, the virus activates and mutates them. I personally want to give the T-Phobos creativity points because it has to do with, it's not dealing with genetic compatibility, it's dealing with whether or not somebody can survive psychologically. And there is a real idea underneath all of that, because fear is not imaginary. When you are terrified, your body changes. Your brain sends alarm signals, stress hormones rise, your heart rate increases, your breathing changes, and your immune system can be affected. And then you've got stress. Stress can influence disease, inflammation, and even the reactivation of some latent infections. So the idea that mental state and infection can interact is not absurd. But the problem is turning fear into some biological switch. Fear is messy. One person freezes, another panics, another gets angry, another goes quiet. Even inside of the same person, fear changes depending on a multitude of things. Exhaustion, trauma, hormones, memory, the situation around them. And a virus isn't going to have a little panic meter where, the needle hits red and the body immediately becomes a monster. This is what T-Phobos is doing. Infected have bracelets that read their fear. Fear activates the virus, and then they mutate. We can take a look at Pedro Fernandez. I almost said Pedro Pascal, but Pedro Fernandez is a good example of this because we see that in the bar, fear takes over him, and then he transforms into a drill-armed monster. We do have Moira, though. Moira is an interesting case. Her arc is basically the human counter-argument to the virus. She is terrified, but in the good ending, she overcomes the moment that would break her. She survives and doesn't become a monster. So Alex is trying to measure fear as if courage is a biological trait that she can sort people by. Scientifically, that is an issue. Courage is not a genetic or viral compatibility marker. You're not going to find courage in blood. Alex Wesker is looking at fear as if it's chemistry. But fear is a whole body and whole life response. But the final thing here is Alex's real goal, which is that she wants to escape death by transferring her consciousness into Natalia. This is where T-Phobos connects back to the same memory problem that we discussed with the Executor virus. Realism score for this one is 3.5 out of 10. T-Phobos gets points because fear has real physical effects, stress can influence infection, and a dormant virus reacting to body chemistry is not impossible as a starting concept. Resident Evil Heavenly Island is a manga tie-in to Revelations 2 and Umbrella Corps set after Resident Evil 6. The story takes place on Sonido de Tortuga, a tropical island where a reality show called Idol Survival is being filmed, but behind the scenes the island is connected to Alex Wesker's abandoned research. TerraSave sends Claire Redfield and Inez Diaco to investigate a biohazard outbreak, and once they arrive they discover that the island is crawling with new BOWs created through the Kodoku plan. The name Kodoku comes from an old poison ritual where several venomous creatures are trapped together until only one survives, with the final survivor supposedly becoming the strongest curse. That is basically the premise of this project. Infect multiple subjects, create mutants, force them through brutal competition, then take samples from the strongest surviving result. Alex began the project in an attempt to create a system for refining monsters, and after she left for Zion Island, Dirk Miller picked up where she left off, even exploiting the local population for test subjects by posing as a shaman. Now, the real idea behind this is selection pressure, which means certain traits survive because the environment favors them. If one organism survives better than another, that trait can become more common over time. Think of selection pressure as the environmental factor that drives evolution, while natural selection is the effect. It is the sorting process. But as mentioned prior, this isn't something that happens over a short period, but rather across multiple populations and generations, and for that reason, the Kodoku virus gets a realism score of 2 out of 10. Next, we move on to a virus designed around controlled activation, the A virus from Resident Evil Vendetta. In the movie, Glenn Arias uses the Animality Virus as a 3-part system, a latent form that can infect people without immediately transforming them, a trigger that activates the infection, and thirdly, a vaccine/countermeasure that protects selected people from being attacked. So instead of releasing one virus and hoping that it kills the right person, Arias can infect a population through water supply, for an example, wait, and then activate the outbreak through the air when and where he wants. Latency is grounded in real life. A latent virus is basically a virus that is hiding quietly inside of a body instead of causing immediate disease. Herpes virus would be like the easiest example for me to point out. They can remain inside of a human body for life and then reactivate later. A trigger system is actually not a completely absurd concept as well. In biology and biotech, scientists can build biological switches. As usual, speed and result is the issue. Even if you were to trigger a latent infection, you're not going to turn into a cannibalistic monster in seconds. The biggest inconsistency that I noticed with the A virus is that at the end of the movie, when Rebecca creates this cure/vaccine for the A virus, everybody in the city who was infected gets turned back to normal. First off, this means that in the hallway scene, Leon and Chris didn't actually massacre a bunch of zombies, they massacred scores of people. I mean, I understand that they were both being attacked and there's no way out of that. They had to do what they had to do, but at the same time, I think that would weigh heavily on them, knowing that if we hadn't killed these people, they could have gone back to normal after we got the vaccine. That's crazy, but not as insane as how vaccines work in real life. A vaccine trains a body's immune system before or shortly after exposure so that that body can recognize the threat faster for when the virus comes, so that it has the antibodies for it. But what it is not is a magic undo button for severe brain damage, tissue destruction, or full body transformation. If an infected person is only in the early stage and the virus hasn't caused permanent damage yet, then sure, reversing the infection is at least somewhat more plausible. However, in the movie, we see the extent for these infected people are pretty high, so quote-unquote curing them should not simply return them to normalcy. The Animality Virus gets a score of 5 out of 10. Latency, controlled activation, and the idea of countermeasure built into the system is a real thing that the A virus proposes, but we are going to take away some points because the activation, execution, and vaccine logic only works in Resident Evil and not in real-world immunology. But moving on to the movie that follows after, we have the advanced T virus from Resident Evil Death Island, where we actually get to see Jill Valentine again after so long. When is Capcom going to bring her back again? One thing worth noting from this movie is the delivery system for the advanced T virus. In the movie, Rebecca discovers that the victims are not getting infected by normal means, not the same way that they've been seeing infections spread before. They don't have bites or scratches on their bodies. Instead, they have needle marks, which points to direct injection. Later on, the heroes discover mosquito-like drones are being used to infect specific targets. Dylan Blake, the main villain of this story, uses this tech to choose who gets infected. This is smart, because direct injection bypasses many of the barriers a virus normally has to overcome, but all it does is make spreading the infection more controlled. The advanced strain still has the classic Resident Evil host range problem. Somehow, it works in humans and large marine mammals while producing extreme effects in both. In fact, at the very end, our heroes have to face a giant mutated sea creature Dylan. So the realism score for this one's going to be a 4 out of 10. Again, the delivery system and a targeted injected pathogen makes sense as a bioweapon, but that's just about where that train stops. Next, we move into the mold era, where Resident Evil stops leaning on viruses and begins building horror out of something closer to fungus. The mold from Resident Evil 7, also called the Megamycete, is the biological agent connected to Evelyn, or E001, an engineered BOW created by the Connections. The mold behaves like a living colony that can grow through bodies, spread through environments, and produce creatures called molded. That already makes the mold more believable than most of Resident Evil's viruses because a fungus-like organism can physically grow, spread through tissue and form colonies, and in the real world, fungi can infect humans, animals, and plants. It also works better than something like the T-Virus because it spreads as its own growing organism instead of somehow forcing every cell in a host to transform on command. But then we have Evelyn who enters the picture. While Eve infects people, she also has this power to influence what they see, feel, and behave. Case in point, the Baker family's minds are being warped by Evelyn's need for a family. The hallucination part is surprisingly something steeped in reality, a bit. Biological toxins and drugs can alter perception, mood, and behavior. However, the controlling others bit is harder to vindicate. The mold would need to affect the brain precisely enough to preserve the Bakers as recognizable people whilst making them obedient and emotionally attached to Eve. That is an extremely narrow target. Then we get the molded, which are basically mobile colonies of mold shaped into humanoid monsters. Real fungi colonies are able to grow and react to the environment, but they don't build themselves into creatures that attack things. But again, the mold does have some ground to stand on, so we're going to give it a realism score of 5.5 out of 10. Now we go deeper into the same biology and reach the Megamycete from Resident Evil Village. The mold era started with RE7, but RE8 reveals the older organism underneath it all. The Megamycete is a massive fungal-like root network buried beneath the village that Mother Miranda discovers after losing her daughter Ava to the Spanish flu. And her entire experiment grows from one belief. If the Megamycete absorbed Ava's consciousness, then her daughter could somehow be brought back to life. Mold, as a fungus, makes sense in some capacity, but once we start looking at human minds like save files, we start taking points off for realism. 3 out of 10. But staying inside of Village and moving from the root system to Miranda's delivery system, we have the Cadou Parasite. After discovering the mold, Miranda spends decades trying to experiment on villagers, implanting the Cadou parasites into them, hoping that the right host will survive and become the perfect vessel for Ava. And then the game starts talking about affinity, which means compatibility between a host and the Cadou. Now that part does have some real logic. Some bodies would handle an infection or parasite better than others, but the problem is what the compatibility produces. In Resident Evil, if you're a bad match, you die or you become a lichen. If you're a good match, have high compatibility, like Lady Dimitrescu, you might become one of Miranda's lords. In reality, host compatibility can affect whether someone survives an infection, but it's not going to make vampires or Magnetos. Still, the Cadou is one of the better Resident Evil ideas on paper because it does combine parasites and fungal influence as well as host compatibility, but then the game starts to use that idea to justify almost every monster archetype that they throw into this game. So we're going to give this a realism score of 4.5 out of 10. Moving on to the new kid on the block, the newest viral threat in the streets, we have the mutated T-Virus, also called Racoon City Syndrome from Resident Evil 9, Requiem. The premise behind this is that residual T-Virus can remain inside of a body instead of being fully cleared out. In Resident Evil, individuals with specific antibodies are capable of holding the virus back for a while, but because the virus is not completely suppressed, it mutates over time, becoming resistant to those antibodies, and eventually it activates. When that happens, black bruise-like marks appear on the body, followed by coughing, numbness, internal damage, vomiting blood, and then death, with terminal patients usually dying within 1 to 2 hours. Of course, Leon is the quintessential example of this because we see how he endures this throughout Resident Evil Requiem, but it does beg the question, how are Jill and Chris doing? We do know about Elpis, we're going to talk about that soon here, but how is Jill handling this? How is Chris dealing with this? I think it's worth pointing out that if you paid attention to the Shadow of Rose DLC, you'll know that Chris is still alive well into the future, just a lot older, so you can probably guess that, in retrospect at least, that Elpis got to Chris, and Chris is completely fine. But I don't know if Capcom did that on purpose. Capcom's been pretty consistent with not bringing back certain people. Like Alex Wesker, when is she coming back? They left her on a cliffhanger. Billy Cohen, we don't know what's going on with him. Jake, what happened with Jake? I thought he and Sherry were going to be a thing. But side tangent aside, a hidden infection becoming active later is real. A virus changing under immune pressure is also real. If the body keeps fighting a virus without fully eliminating it, variants that survive that pressure can become harder for the immune system to control. So the basic setup works like this. The body has these antibodies that resist the T-Virus, but the T-Virus would eventually begin to adapt to it, and once it becomes strong enough to resist the antibodies, the infection breaks through. Then Requiem brings the mutated T-Virus back into zombie territory. In fact, it is more so pronounced in RE9. These infected retain more fragments of their old memories, habits, and skills than classic T-Virus zombies, with the director describing them as almost human, but not quite. That's why we see some of the zombies still cleaning bathrooms or singing. Real-world angle, people with neurological damage can sometimes preserve certain learned behaviors while losing other functions. However, the things that we've already talked about with the zombies and how the virus destroys the brain cancels everything else out. Raccoon City Syndrome, or RCS, has 2 different realism levels happening at once. As a delayed antibody-resistant T-virus illness, it is surprisingly plausible for Resident Evil. But when we go full zombie, never go full zombie, but when we go full zombie, it gives us a realism score of 4 out of 10. But before we continue, Elpis deserves a short medical realism note. For most of the story, different characters assume that Elpis is Spencer's final weapon, but in a twist of events, it turns out that it was a powerful antiviral capable of neutralizing all progenitor-based BOWs. As a basic medical concept, we know that antivirals are real drugs. However, stopping a virus is one thing, while repairing everything that the virus already damaged is another thing. An antiviral should not simply reset a person back to normal. Leon should be dead if the infection had already caused so much irreversible damage. We see dude was coughing up puddles of blood. He was on the brink of death. This shows that he was internally destroyed by the T-Virus, but then Grace gives him Elpis and he's totally fine. However, Zeno also gets Elpis, and him losing his enhanced abilities doesn't make sense either. If his powers depend on active viral processes, then suppressing the virus could weaken him. But if the virus already rebuilt parts of his body like it did with Wesker, Elpis would need to do a lot more than just block replication. It would have to reverse physical changes that already happened. Medical realism note for Elpis, 4 out of 10, but it's, we're not really grading that on the leaderboard here. Out of all 23 pathogens explained, Las Plagas takes the top spot because parasites in real life can live inside of hosts and influence behavior. But again, in Resident Evil, it's super exaggerated. In real life, we're not going to be seeing parasites taking over people. At the very bottom of the rankings, we have the 4D Executor Virus, because it turns infection into body-hopping consciousness transfer, which is just straight dog waffles. Also, I had some waffles with my wife yesterday. I love my wife.